The train had not waited. She stood on the platform at Galt's Crossing with her trunk at her feet, and the October wind coming off the flats in a way that was not so much cold as it was certain. It was the kind of wind that knew it owned everything between here and the horizon, which in Saskatchewan was a considerable distance. The station agent, an older man with the name Galt stitched into his vest, told her the homestead was 4 miles east and offered her nothing further in the way of assistance. She had read the advertisement twice in a boarding house in Regina. Horse operation near Galt's Crossing requires experienced hand. Accommodation provided. Arrangements negotiable. The word negotiable had been the deciding factor. It was a word that meant the man who wrote it had not fully decided what he needed, which meant she would have room to be what she was rather than what someone expected. He was not at the station. She walked the 1/4 mile to the livery and found him there, harnessing a roan gelding to a flatbed wagon with a slowness that had nothing to do with patience. He was perhaps 35. He looked recently reduced, the way a fire looks the morning after, still lit but smaller than it had been. He did not apologize for not meeting her train. She did not ask him to. The drive east took 30 minutes. She counted the fence posts as they passed, 42 standing, 9 leaning, and a long stretch near the creek crossing that had given up entirely and lay flat in the grass. The pasture to the south carried horses. She counted 11, possibly 12, and they were not in poor condition exactly, but they were not prospering either. She could see that from the road. She did not say so. The house was timber-framed, which surprised her. Better built than she had expected, though someone had started a lean-to addition on the north side and stopped partway through. The rafters stood bare against the gray sky like the ribs of something unfinished. There was a garden plot that had been attempted and abandoned, frost-bitten carrot tops still standing in a row, and at the edge of the poplar bluff to the west, visible only because she was looking, a wooden cross. Simple. The wood still pale enough that the weather hadn't touched it long. She did not ask about it. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Inside, the house smelled of coal smoke and leather and something underneath those, a closed, settled quiet that collects in rooms where one person has been alone for too long. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. A wood stove on the east wall, cold. A deal table with 2 chairs. 2 chairs still, though one of them had a quality of not having been moved in some time, a slight lean to the left, as if whatever weight once filled it had determined a particular angle and stayed. A rope bed in the far corner, with a quilt folded across it in a manner so precise it seemed determined. Shelves above the stove with provisions, arranged in a way that suggested they had been set there once and not touched since. He came in behind her and set her trunk near the wall without being asked. She crossed to the stove and checked the firebox. Gray ash, no warmth. The iron was cold. "When did you bank this last?" she said. "This morning," he said. She looked at the ash. It had not been this morning. She did not contradict him. She asked for the coal box, and he showed her to the lean-to, where the fuel was stacked against the inner wall and partially exposed to the sky where the rafters had no boarding yet. Enough for now, not enough for January. She brought 3 loads in herself before he moved to help. He favored his right leg slightly when he bent to lift, a careful accommodation that had become unconscious. She could tell by the way he didn't notice he was doing it. She filed that away. The stove caught on the second attempt. She had water heating before he said much of anything further. He stood near the door with the same uncertainty she'd seen in the yard, a man not entirely sure of his own threshold. She opened the provisions and began to work. "The horses," she said, without turning around. "What about them?" "The bay mare in the near paddock. She hasn't been worked today." A pause. "No." "And the one with the blaze, she's favoring her left foreleg." Longer pause. "I noticed." She turned then and looked at him directly for the first time since the station. He was perhaps 36, possibly younger under the weathering. His jaw held a particular stubbornness she recognized, the kind that comes from a man who has been failing at something steadily and has grown too tired to hide it, but not tired enough to ask for help. There was flour on his sleeve from something he hadn't mentioned. There was something around his eyes that was not quite grief anymore. But the place grief goes when it has been sitting too long without resolution. I'll look at her after we eat, she said, and you should tell me what contract is coming due and when. He said nothing, but she heard him pull out a chair. She set supper without ceremony. Beans and salt pork, a heel of bread she'd found wrapped in cloth near the window, water from the bucket in 2 tin cups. She put his cup on the table without asking whether he wanted it. He watched her do these things the way a man watches someone rearrange a room he'd forgotten was supposed to be arranged. They ate. Outside, the wind had steadied into a low, persistent push against the north wall. "NWMP contract," she said. He looked up. "You have one." The advertisement said a horse operation. Out here, that either means rail company or the mounted police, and there are no rail camps east of here anymore. She kept her voice level. "Which is it, and when does it renew?" He set his fork down. "Mounted police. Remount contract for the Capel detachment. 12 horses a year, broken to saddle and voice steady. The renewal assessment is March." She did the arithmetic in her head, just under 5 months. "How many do you have currently that would pass?" He was quiet in the way that was not evasion but painful calculation. 4, possibly 5. Spearman thinks the gray could pass if someone put consistent work into her through the winter. Who is Spearman? Neighbor. Quarter section north. He's helped when he could. She noted that. A neighbor who had helped when he could suggested limits on that help. The kind of limits that came from a man's own troubles or from a situation that had grown difficult in ways that were not comfortable to witness. She finished her supper and pushed back from the table. "I'll go look at the mare." The barn was large enough to have been built with ambition. It had the bones of a serious operation. 12 stalls, a tack room on the west end, a hayloft that ran the full length. But the loft was only a third full, and the stalls held 8 horses where there should have been 15. The remaining animals stood in the paddock, and she could see their shapes through the gap in the north wall, where a board had come loose and not been refastened. She took the lantern from the hook and walked to the bay mare in the end stall. She ran her hand down the foreleg, feeling for heat, for give, for the particular tenderness that told her what she needed to know. Soft tissue, not bone, a strain, not a break. Rest and time and careful movement. The mare pressed her nose into the lamp glow, more curious than afraid, which told her something about how the horses had been handled here. She moved slowly through the barn after that, holding the lantern high. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was letting what was wrong announce itself. What announced itself was less than she had feared. The tack was old but maintained. The bridles hung from their pegs with the bits properly cleaned, not thrown. A breeding chart on the wall of the tack room done in 2 hands. The first a careful, precise script, the second a looser and more hurried one. She held the lantern close. The careful hand stopped abruptly 2/3 of the way down the page. The second hand picked up on the same line, season, with a gap of only a week between them. She looked at the chart for a long time. She came back to the house with the lantern and the cold in her coat and found him at the table with a ledger and a stub of pencil. He did not look up. The pencil moved in short strokes, adding numbers that did not appear to be arriving at anything encouraging. She hung up her coat. She set the lantern on the shelf and took the chair across from him. "The chart in the tack room," she said, 2 sets of handwriting. He set the pencil down. He looked at the ledger instead of her. "The second hand is yours," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "When did the first one stop?" He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "February last year." She waited. Outside, something moved against the barn boards, a horse shifting, or the wind finding a new angle. "The mare favors her left foreleg," she said. "Soft tissue. She'll need rest and then gradual work. She can still be contract ready by March if you start her right in January." She pulled the ledger toward her. "Can I see this?" He did not cover it. That told her something. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were close to it. Feed costs had run high the previous winter. A sale of 3 horses in the autumn had covered only the smaller of 2 outstanding debts. The larger one, a note held by a man named Dunmore in Regina, came due in April. "What do you have that isn't listed here?" she said. He looked up. On the land, in the herd, what haven't you counted? He was slow to answer. There are 4 mares in the south pasture. I haven't brought them in yet. And there's a stallion I haven't assessed this year. She asked him to describe the stallion. He described a gray 16 hands, bought in 1891 from a breeder near Moose Jaw. Good disposition, strong hind quarters. The mounted police liked gray horses for the detachment work, easier to spot in low visibility. And the breeding program on the chart, was that the gray's line? He looked toward the tack room, though he could not see it from where he sat. Mostly, he said. She had ideas about what kind of horse the police needed. She spent 3 years talking to the men at the detachment about what conditions they worked in, what they needed the horses to do. She wrote it all down. She let the word she sit there without asking. He said after a moment, there's a journal. She waited. He did not move immediately. He looked at the ledger and then at the lamp which she had turned low. Then he stood, went to the back of the house and came back with a small book. The cover was dark green leather, worn at the corners. He set it on the table between them without speaking and sat back down. She picked it up. The handwriting inside was the precise hand from the chart. She opened to the first page and read in silence. The woman who had written this had not been keeping a diary. She had been conducting a study. The entries were dated and methodical. Observed Sergeant Kilpatrick's detachment at drill today. The roan broke twice on the rifle discharge. The gray from Hartwick's line held steady. A margin note below. Temperament more trainable in the 2nd-generation cross. Must be selected for, not assumed. She turned pages slowly. The woman had understood something about horses and about the men who would ride them that most breeders spent their whole careers missing. She had not been breeding for appearance or for size. She had been breeding for what she called steadiness under pressure, a quality that was less about the horse's nerve and more about its ability to trust the rider in conditions that frightened it. Page after page of observations, 3 years of them, and then a final entry in December, the handwriting slightly less certain, the pen held a little differently. Gray Duchess foaled this morning. Good legs, held her head up within the hour. The line is working. After that, nothing. She set the book down. She looked at the man across the table. He was watching her with the expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and is not sure whether putting it down will make it heavier or lighter. She knew exactly what she was building, she said. He said nothing. The gray you have now, is he from Duchess's line? He's her 3rd foal. She looked at the journal, then at the breeding chart she could still picture on the tack room wall. The second hand, his, had continued the crosses exactly as the first had established them. He had not deviated once. He had carried the program forward without, she suspected, fully understanding that he was carrying it. You've been following her notes, she said, even without reading them. He turned his cup in his hands. The fire ticked in the stove. I kept the same pairings, he said. It seemed wrong to change them. She considered that. It was a kind of faithfulness that was not sentimental but structural. He had done what she would have done, kept the thread intact because the thread was all there was. She said, the program she was working toward is close. Maybe 1 more generation to fix the temperament reliably. But the horses you have now are better than you know, the gray especially. She pulled the ledger back and looked at the contract figures. If you can get 8 horses to assessment standard by March, you'll renew the contract. If you renew at a higher rate, 12 to 15 horses annually, you can clear the Dunmore note by autumn. He looked at her steadily. Can we get 8 ready? She thought about the mare with the foreleg, about the 4 mares in the south pasture she hadn't seen yet, about the gray stallion, about what she'd read in the journal and what she'd seen in the barn, and how those 2 things were pointing in the same direction. I need to see the south pasture horses tomorrow, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then I didn't expect you to ask about the contract. When I put the advertisement in, I thought. He stopped. What did you think? I'm not sure. That someone would come and the house would be less empty. I hadn't thought past the arriving. She understood that. She had not thought past the arriving either. But she was thinking past it now, with the journal under her hand and the numbers on the ledger and the sound of the horses settling in the barn beyond the wall. The assessment is March, she said. That's 22 weeks. I know. Show me the south pasture at first light. He was up before her, which she hadn't expected. When she came down in the dark, he was already at the stove, and the coffee was black and hot, and his coat was on. He was not a man who moved slowly in the mornings, whatever else he was. They went out before full light, when the sky over the flats was the color of old bruising fading at the edges. He walked the south pasture fence line with her in the order a man walks something he knows by heart. She said nothing. She looked. The south pasture was better than the numbers had suggested. The grass was dry but not depleted. The 4 mares moved well, one with a slight roughness in the right shoulder that would need watching, but nothing that consistent training wouldn't correct. Their eyes were calm. They were not afraid of being approached. At the far end of the pasture, near the creek, was a structure she had not been told about. A small log shelter, 3-sided, built into the bank with a Prairie skill that kept it warmer than its size suggested. Someone had repaired the roof recently. She could see the new shingles by the color of the wood, pale against the weathered gray. She put her hand on the doorframe and pressed. Solid. You built this, she said. Extended it, he said. It was here from before. She looked at the care in the extension work. Competent. Not hurried. Done by someone who expected to still be using it. She filed that away. The gray stallion was in the far corner of the pasture. He was everything the man had described. 16 hands, solid through the haunches, a coat the color of winter cloud. He watched them cross the grass with ears forward and no particular alarm. She stopped 20 feet off and stood still, letting him decide. He took 2 steps toward her, stopped, considered. She did not move toward him. She waited. After a full minute, he walked to her and pressed his nose against her coat sleeve. She let him stay there. She put one hand flat against his neck and felt his breathing slow by a single measure. She named him, she said quietly. The man beside her was silent for a moment. Yes. She did not ask what the name had been. She stayed with her hand on the gray's neck until he lifted his head of his own accord and moved off toward the water trough. Some things you did not need to ask about. They had their own weight and their own answers, and the answers were not always yours to hold. That afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with both books open side by side, the journal and the breeding ledger, and she worked through them the way her father had taught her to work through any complex record. Slowly looking for the pattern beneath the pattern. He sat near the stove and did not interrupt. He poured coffee at some point and set a cup beside her hand without asking. Then he sat back down and waited. She was aware that most men would have asked questions or left the room. He stayed and was quiet, and she noted that without writing it down. What she found in the 2 books together was more complete than either alone. The journal explained the why of each pairing. The ledger recorded the what, the foals, the dates, the outcomes. Laid side by side, the intention became legible. The woman had been building toward a horse that would pass the NWMP's temperament assessment, not just on a calm day, but on a difficult one. A horse that did not spook at rifle fire, at crowds, at the smell of smoke. A horse that had been bred over generations to trust the rider's signals over its own fear. She wrote for the better part of 2 hours. She crossed things out. She turned back to earlier pages 3 times to confirm dates. The man refilled her coffee once and said nothing. When she set the pencil down, she had reached a conclusion she had not expected when she started. The program in the journal would work. But it needed one thing she had not initially seen. The second stallion, the one the journal called the Bay experiment, had not been a failure. He had produced one foal that carried both qualities, the drive of his line and the steadiness of the graze. That foal was 3 years old and standing in the near paddock outside. She told him this. He read the page she pushed toward him slowly, then read it again. She thought that foal was ordinary, he said. She wrote that note in January, she said. He was 8 months old. He wasn't done yet. She tapped a ledger entry from the previous April, written in the second hand, his. A single line, Bay colt calm through branding day, didn't pull. He looked at what he had written without knowing its significance. "You noticed," she said. "You just didn't know what you were noticing." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night had gone very still in the way it goes still out here when the temperature is serious about falling. The lamp between them threw light upward and made his face unfamiliar in the way that lamplight does. "Older or younger or simply other," she said. "I'll need to work with all 4 mares through November. Consistent, daily work. And the bay colt needs to be started properly before the ground freezes hard." He said, "You know how to start a horse?" She said, "I know enough. And I know what the journal says about his line, which is more useful than what I know." He looked at the journal, then at her. She said, "I'll stay through the assessment in March. After that," she paused. "After that, I'd want to see whether the colt passes, whether I was right about him." He said nothing. He looked at the lamp instead, the way a man looks at something when he is working to appear calmer than he is, and mostly succeeding. The stove ticked. The wind had gone quiet enough that she could hear the horses in the barn, the particular sound of them settling for the night. Weight shifted, breath slowed, the soft percussion of an animal that has decided a place is safe. She had not meant it as a declaration. She had meant it as an answer to a question that had not been asked directly, but had been present in every exchange since she stepped off the train. He understood that, she thought. The way he sat with it, not reaching for more words but not leaving them either, told her he understood more than he had said. She thought about the journal, about the woman who had spent 3 years talking to mounted police officers and writing what she learned in a green leather book, and breeding toward a horse that did not exist yet, who had stood in a cold barn in December and watched a foal get to its feet and understood what she was looking at, who had not lived long enough to see what she'd built. Some things you build for the next person. You don't always get to know who that is. The assessment in March went the way she had said it would. 7 horses passed. The 8th, the bay mare, her foreleg healed and her training sound, passed with a written commendation from the sergeant at the detachment, who noted in his report that she was the steadiest animal he had put a nervous recruit on in 4 years. The contract renewed at 14 horses annually. The bay colt passed the following spring without hesitation. She stayed through that foaling season and the one after, and the question of how long she intended to remain stopped being asked somewhere in the 3rd year. In the way questions stop being asked when the answer has already been given by everything except the words. 26 years later, a young constable on a posting north stopped at the homestead to have his horse's shoe checked. He asked the old rancher who had built the operation. The old man was gray at the temples now, and walked with a careful economy around the right leg that had never quite straightened after a fence post incident in 1901. He did not answer right away. He looked across the yard to where a woman was working in the round pen with a 3-year-old colt, her movements as spare and deliberate as they had ever been. One hand on the lead line, one hand at her side. The colt circling with his ears soft, learning the shape of a person who would not rush him. The old man told the constable she had come in the fall of 1893, when everything was nearly done. He said she had read his wife's journal and understood what it meant. He said she had stayed. The constable watched her work for a moment. "Has she always been like that?" he said. "With the horses?" Old man considered. "She reads what's actually there," he said. "Not what she hopes is there, or what she's afraid is there." In the pen, the colt had stopped circling. He stood with his head low and his breathing even, and she moved to him and put one hand flat against his neck, the same way she had put her hand against the gray stallion's neck on that first October morning. Not tenderness, exactly, but something older than tenderness. Acknowledgement. The recognition of one creature by another that has decided for now to trust. The constable thanked the old man for the shoe and rode on north. She was already moving on to the next thing, the way she always had, without announcement, without looking to see if anyone was watching. The colt followed her to the gate on his own, unhurried, certain of the hand that held the line.